Hi, I'm Bob Doyle, the information philosopher, webcasting from my ITV studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm hoping to reach philosophers and scientists around the world to help solve some great problems in philosophy, in physics, in biology, and in psychology. I'm hoping to reach any of you out there wondering about the deepest nature of reality and our place in the universe. We live in the information age, but I have found that very few philosophers or scientists understand the deep nature of information. Information is neither matter nor energy. Information needs matter to be embodied in our brains, for example, and it needs energy to be communicated like this lecture coming to you over the internet. But matter and energy are conserved quantities. It may be hard to believe, but the total amount of matter and energy today is the same as there was at the beginning of the universe, nearly 14 billion years ago. And if the stuff of the material world is just a fixed total amount, one can possibly explain all the evolutionary change that we see. I will explain those changes as an increase in the information and order in the universe, which have been increasing since the beginning of time, despite the second law of thermodynamics, which says that entropy increasing will destroy order. I'll show that change is the arrangement of the atoms and molecules in the universe into what I call information structures, like the galaxies, the stars, and the planets. Stars, though, are passive objects under the complete control of physical forces like gravity. But living things, you and I, are dynamic and information and growing information structures under our own control. I'll show that we are forms through which matter and energy continuously flow, and I'll show its information processing from the DNA in our cells to the thinking in our minds that controls these flows of matter and energy. Okay, if it's Tuesday, as they say on Meet the Press, our topic is free will. And let me take a look at my free will book here on my table and tell you that let's see if I can take this to a little more of a close-up, perhaps too close. I am taking today's subject of determinism, determinisms plural, from chapter 9 of my book on free will. Now today I'm going to, come over to this page, zoom in on my screen behind me, and show that we have a listing of determinisms, which it's quite amazing. Although I believe there's only one way to explain free will, by coming up with an idea of where the freedom is in free will and where the will or the determination is, because we need some determination. We just don't need any predeterminism or predestination or any of the many claims that what we're doing is something just happening to us as things that we are making happen, that we are creatively bringing into the world, and that fundamentally we're in charge and not something else, some puppeteer in the sky, some neurons in our brain, etc., etc. Now, we've learned that there are many objections to free will, and the most prominent position of philosophers today, and many scientists, is that we are determined because we are reducible to the material bodies that we inhabit, and that because we're reducible to our material, we can basically say that free will, they think, is an illusion. However, I'm going to, as you know, try to make the case for where some randomness, some chance, some new things could happen and be involved in the first stage of my model of free will, which the first stage generates possibilities for our ideas, possibilities for our actions, and then we quickly, maybe a fraction of a second, make a decision between those alternative possibilities, picking out one to go with, one to choose. Our decision can be very fast, but the fact that it is a decision is important, and the fact that when we decide, the action we then do take is adequately determined by our motives, by our feelings, by our desires. Whether it's an everyday silly decision to, choose chocolate or vanilla, or much more substantial decisions, which carry a lot of moral responsibility, the fundamental model I have is really just free first stage in the sense of new possibilities, some of which may have just popped into our minds, may be totally random, maybe not even the best thing to do, but we may do them and then find out that they're not the best thing to do. We may have alternative possibilities which include things we are going to be a mistake for us, but the mere fact of there being a mistake is something we'll learn in the process of making mistakes. There are some great philosophers, some great mathematicians in particular. I think a quote I remember about Henri Poincaré, who was widely believed to be the most capable mathematician and scientist of his day, and people praised him for being so extraordinarily capable and so much better than all the other mathematicians and working in science in his day, which was the turn of the 20th century. And Poincaré, they said, you must never make mistakes. And Poincaré was said to have replied, well, nonsense. Actually, I make more mistakes than anyone else I know, but I learn from those mistakes. And that's why I'm able to publish so many things that seem right to everyone else, just that he tries and succeeds enough. By trying many, many times, he's succeeding more often than anyone else, but he also has generated more mistakes than anyone else. It reminds a bit in sports, in baseball, the greatest home run hitter in his day was famously Babe Ruth, but it was Babe Ruth not only held the record until recent decades for the most home runs hit in one season, he also held the record for the most strikeouts in a season. And it was, in a sense, the combination of things. He tried so many times with his utmost power to put the ball out of the baseball park, but in the process, he missed it more than anyone else at the same time. So I encourage you to think, when you're trying to be creative, don't think too badly of your mistakes. Pursue them a bit and prove to yourself that they aren't the best way to go. And when you do come up with one that's a good new thought or for a good new action, then you'll go with that. Now, before I get into determinisms and start showing you some of my screens, that will be this, no, not that one, but this screen. We'd like to look at determinism. But before we go there, I'd like to just mention a couple of things we've done, and let me see if I can find where they are for us to look at. Here's a page into the website that reminds that what I'm doing, the work I'm providing, is based on web pages, but it's also based on books, 3 books so far, and a 4th one on the way. The first book is Free Will, The Scandal in Philosophy. The second one is Great Problems. And the third is Metaphysics. And then I have about 16 or so chapters in my book on Albert Einstein and how he invented most of quantum mechanics. So I'm providing you, I'm hoping you will find valuable my books, but also my many, many web pages on philosophers and scientists, 200 philosophers or so and around 100 scientists, where I pull together resources for you if you want to research deeply into many of these thinkers I will try to tell you their contributions to questions like free will and problem of knowledge, the problem of value, and many other problems like philosophy of mind. But what I want to show you technically, I mentioned yesterday that we added a problems drop-down menu, which is new on the website, and I'm hoping to have brief descriptions of these problems for you. Instead of these 1-hour lectures, I'll try to produce something more concise, 5 or 10 minutes on each of these problems and where I think the problem is at the current state of philosophy and where it might be if we started thinking about it in terms of information. Now, another thing that I've just done is I've added links to Facebook and to Twitter and to YouTube. And I've been working on how to get them organized in here. So if I refresh this page, they'll jump into the upper right corner, I hope. Yes, I'm trying to learn how to use these social media tools. Let me go to my home page. And on the home page, I've also added these links into this little box. And I hope that you will consider sharing some of my i5 pages with your followers on social media. Here's a link to share on Facebook pages, and here's a link to tweet and hopefully get retweeted my pages. Now, notice these links, I'm learning how to do all of this stuff. I've put the links up here, and I have 2 little links to Facebook and to my Facebook page and to my YouTube lectures page. But those are different from linking and just saying you like a page. Now, the challenge I had was to put these links on every single page. So let's, for example, go to the problems page, and with a little luck, and they come up a little awkwardly. I'm not so good at this business of web pages in the very best way it's done these days. But here, there's this link to tweet would say, prepare a tweet for you to send out about this page on problems in philosophy and physics. And let's try it. So maybe you'll try it when you visit me. And here, this is really, it is coming up. Share this link with your followers. Now, this blue section here is something you can write a different note if you want to. You know, see Bob's problems list and so forth, or anything else you want to add to tell your followers. Below it is a link to this page, and I guess you have to leave that one alone. But let's see. So that's about the idea there. And I think we'll get a similar thing if we hit the share page. So in this case, we get a list, the name of the page, and a description, which is very nice, and then a place for you to add a few words if you want to add, and then post it to your Facebook page. So I hope you'll find those useful, and it would be, of course, very lucky for me if I interest you enough to tell your friends about what we're doing with our philosophy. So let's go back then to the page on determinisms. And it's somewhat surprising that there are so many different, essentially different arguments about how everything is determined. And only one argument, as far as I could see, that makes the case that we human beings are free and creative. Indeed, the freedom that I see extends down to a lot of other organisms, the higher animals, and they have minds, as far as I can tell, and they have feelings, many of the things we have. The only thing that higher animals lack is the ability to speak to one another like this. And the knowledge that we've acquired as human beings depends a great deal on our ability to communicate it. And I can argue, I think, that the ability to create new knowledge, new ideas, share them with others by communicating them, And I do believe, it may be presumptuous, but I do suggest that we're at a time in the evolution of human societies where, in a time when our ability to communicate our knowledge to one another has never been greater. Of course, over the centuries, we've developed wonderful things like books, and used in teaching in our schools, and so we teach our young from a base of knowledge which we've now embodied in print materials. And then in this century, or the last 20th century, we developed the ability to communicate with others, not just in person and not just by giving them something to read that we think is important for them to read. For centuries, there was very little in the form of written materials. Often that meant that the little school books that were available were very limited. There were holy texts which are read and memorized by many people. But the enormous production of books has grown to be a great resource for our universities, and we read not only those books but also journals, and in particular outside of straight education we read newspapers and so forth. But that's in a very, very dynamic state of change right now. As you all know, social media, which I've just added to my web pages, I hope for the better, has changed a great deal. Today, we can not only talk to one another by telephone, 150 years ago or so, 130, but today, people who have the ability to prepare programming for the media, they can reach worldwide audiences. You know, famous American channels like CNN are seen all over the world. And where 40 years ago now, let's see, 33 years ago now, I wrote the first desktop publishing program to enable people to create books like mine in a program called a desktop publishing program. Today, that's a wonderful tool for me, and I can write up my books. I can design them to include illustrations and these little tabs on the edges, and all of this layout and so forth can be done by you. Should you want to produce a book, you can send the PDFs output from a program like InDesign, which is the successor to the program I wrote 33 years ago, the first desktop publishing program called Mac Publisher for Macintosh, which had just come out in 1984. But today, besides creating a print book, which to me was the best example of communicating knowledge to others and read in schools and so forth. Today there are much different ways of communicating, and all our young people are doing them. They're using their cell phones to send text messages to one another, to send images to one another, making videos today, putting those videos up on YouTube and so forth, and Facebook. So it's a really dramatically different time, and if I want to reach, especially do want to reach young people whose minds are not yet necessarily formed by the standard sort of indoctrination, should we call it, the standard development of cultures which are rather different from one another around the world. Not that I dislike the idea of differences, but whereas many of those differences are what we call beliefs, I would hope to be able to communicate knowledge, which I think to be different from just a belief in that tradition is handed down in each society, and hope that that would produce a kind of liberalizing. Yes, the word sounds a little on the left compared to conserving. I don't mean to not conserve traditional knowledge, and there's plenty of room for that in our courses on history and other things, but there are new understandings of how the world works, and in particular how life works with the modern understanding of biology, how the mind works with modern understandings of neuroscience. And I believe I'm hoping to pass on that knowledge in the form of online lectures like this. Now this particular one is set up to run for 1 hour at 3 o'clock in the afternoon every day, and that's partly because it's being broadcast on cable television here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But I also hope to make much shorter, topic-focused, specific problem-focused videos to go on YouTube and Facebook and perhaps other places, so that, as I understand it, young people today are looking for, well-illustrated, well-produced, short, punchy messages where they can perhaps learn something coming to them in their smartphones. And in that respect, the tools are now available. I've spent some time working on them back in the 1990s when language translation systems were being built. My website at the moment is available in 4 languages thanks to Google Translate, Google Translate has now become far and away the fastest automated translation, which means it doesn't do very well with idiomatic expressions, but it does do an extraordinary job of giving anyone in any language the gist, it's called, the fundamental ideas that are inside a written text. Or right now, I haven't turned them on yet. I'm still trying to learn the tools that are available on YouTube, for example. But YouTube will allow me to translate this lecture and create the closed captions, which are down here. There's a caption button at the bottom of your page. And those captions can probably appear in, at the moment, some 40 languages. I have to learn a lot to get them all available to you, but I do hope to do that. Okay, so I'm trying to get these lectures available and out there to people around the world. Primarily and initially, I hope to reach young people who haven't really haven't thought very deeply, as I say, about these problems, but they've heard about them and they would like to know more about them. That's my goal, to be an entry point for people who are budding philosophers and budding scientists who are about to work on these problems going forward, long after I'm out of the picture. So let's turn then to determinisms. And again, it's quite ironic that, to me, that determinisms are so many, and free will is only one. So I write here, determinism is the idea that everything that happens, including all human actions, is completely determined by prior events. There's only one possible future, and it is completely predictable in principle, according to many theories, the most famous one being Laplace's supreme intelligent demon. Assuming perfect knowledge of the positions and velocities of all the atoms in the void, and following the laws of Newton, which had been discovered a century or so before Laplace, it seemed to Laplace that the future must be only one possible future, because the velocities of all the particles in their collisions would be completely determined. If they came in a certain direction and hit one another, they would go off in certain predictable directions. And that should contain the germ of the knowledge of the entire future, not to mention the past, which all together seem to be just one possibility. Now, more strictly, determinism I would like you to distinguish from predeterminism. And the Laplacian picture could arguably be a picture of predeterminism, in the sense that suppose Laplace's demon took all of his knowledge and realized that he knows exactly the positions and velocities of the particles at the beginning of the universe. So if the beginning of the universe contains, as I've argued, the same matter and energy that there exists today, how hard as that is to believe, as I say, it would follow that whatever the conditions in the universe at time zero, and we do in fact have a model of the universe as having been created at a time about 13.75 billion years ago. I have a web page on creation and encourage you to look at it, called Cosmic Creation, under the drop-down menu, in the In Production drop-down menu. But let me open a parenthesis and say, although there is a lot of evidence about creation, and before a certain time we call the origin, we seem to know nothing about it, because the conditions before this earliest known time contain no method for us to understand what must have been going on just before that amazing moment. But also in this parenthesis say that although I hope to be able to tell you the story of that creation, all the way up to the current time, the creation of the material particles, because they had to form. There were no atoms until 400,000 years after the beginning of the universe. There were no objects like galaxies, stars, and planets until 400 million years after the beginning of the universe. There was a great period from the initial time when it was extremely hot, bright, light in all directions, no information structures, nothing except a kind of a chaotic, a smooth haze of photons, of light, very bright, very hot light in all directions. But I'm still in this parenthesis of evidence for creation, which I hope very much to be able to teach you over coming weeks, months, and years. I will unfortunately not be able to give you any evidence at the moment for a creator, for a creative agent. It appears that the entire picture of the evolution of the universe, and we use the word just as we use it for the evolution of life, the evolution of the universe, which involves the creation of the material elements, the creation of the first stars, planets, galaxies, and the lives and deaths of those objects. We have a vision of how a star comes to be out of a gravitating large collection of matter, and it condenses and forms into a beautiful sphere, starting out very chaotic perhaps, becomes a sphere, and then it becomes very hot, and it lives a period of time, sometimes a very short time for the largest stars, and then it dies. Some of them explode as supernovae, others cool down and probably end their lives as a glowing object. So just as we have evolution in living things, we also have stellar evolution and galactic evolution, and the geophysicists and planetary physicists now give us a very interesting picture of the evolution of a planet, how it exists in various stages and itself cools down and so forth. So that's my kind of parenthesis in the subject of creation of the universe and evolution of all of its contents, including us. Let's go back then to our determinisms page and say that I want to distinguish determinism from predeterminism, which is that idea that from the moment of creation, everything that's going to happen in the future is already known. And over the centuries, that was more often described as predestination, where predestination is the idea that the will of an omniscient supreme being has determined the one possible future. And there are many cultures in the world that basically argue a famous phrase like God willing, such and such will happen, as if the will of God is in charge at all times. Now sometimes determinism is confused with causality, and that's a reasonable thing to do. That's the idea that all events have causes, and those causes themselves were events before, and they in turn have their causes in a causal chain. The idea is that in our modern physics, some events may be undetermined by prior events. That kind of an event is called indeterminate, or sometimes known as a causa sui, a self-caused cause or a self-caused event. But it may in turn, such an uncaused event, be the cause for the following events. And they would therefore not be predictable from conditions before the uncaused events. So I'm arguing that events almost always are caused, but if they are not always, but they doesn't mean that they're predictable or predetermined. Okay? Uncaused events are said to break the causal chain of events back to the primordial cause of an unmoved mover, an uncaused cause. Aristotle said there could perhaps also be accidents, and Epicurus' notion that the atoms swerve are important historical examples of such uncaused causes. And so here's my problem today. Although there is only one basic form of indeterminism, which is ontological indeterminism, and that traces to the 20th century discovery of quantum indeterminism. Everything earlier, Epicurus' swerve, or William James' notion that there must be some chance when ideas pop into our heads, or Aristotle's accidents, those were just ideas that we might, those were ideas that there might be sources of randomness, but there was no experimental or theoretical basis for the notion that there were events in the universe that could be truly random and in the sense of the omniscient being would be unknowable, given that there's a being that has as much intelligence as possible, according to Laplace's picture. The quantum nature of indeterminism is basically saying that that cannot be known. And it gets rather dramatic. One of the strongest positions to take on this issue, which was regarded for centuries as an atheistic idea. It's a challenge to the nature of an omniscient being, that there would be things that are, quote, unknowable. And the way to think about that is to listen to Richard Feynman, the great physicist, who said, if the event that is about to be happening, a quantum event, and we're going to make a measurement of something which is at the quantum level, and all we know are the probable outcomes. We know the possible outcomes and probabilities for each one of the possible outcomes. What Feynman is saying is, if the outcome is known by anyone, any entity, knowable in any way whatsoever, then the experimental results would be different. This is very, very deep, very profound notion that the type of indeterminism that's at this deep, not just our knowledge of what's going on, not just ignorance, which tells us, oh, we have to say we only probably know what's going to happen, that it's a question of what we know. No, Feynman says, it's a question that if the knowledge existed, whether in a mind or in a ability to claim that there was only one possibility, or the particular possibility that's about to happen in the next sequence of events, if it's known, the experiments would tell us so. The experiments tell us and give us only a statistical distribution among the possibilities. And each new event is totally unpredictable in the particulars, but it will fit into those possibilities that quantum mechanics predicts, and the predictions are quite amazing. The predictions of quantum mechanics are the most accurate predictions. Quantum mechanics is the most accurate theory of all the physical theories that we have today. Chemistry theories, other theories, all of them really build on the tightest, deepest, strongest, most accurate knowledge that comes out of quantum mechanics. But as accurate as it is, and there are times when it predicts a result that is determined, that is to say, certain. It's not true to say that quantum mechanics is somehow fuzzy and not just indeterminate, but unknowable. There are times when it is knowable. We know there are times when the probability of an outcome is 1. In particular, the theory goes along the line to say, if you measure a system and find it to be in one of, say, 20 possible states, and if you measure it again immediately, without any time for that system to have interacted with the rest of the world so as to change anything, you will, with probability certainty, find that it's in the same state. This gave rise to the idea that we could keep something in a state by measuring it again and again and again and again. It's called the Zeno effect, that maybe we could hold a system in a state. And it turns out those strange ideas have been found to be true. We can set up conditions in experiments where we trap an atomic system in a state and hold it in that state indefinitely. It takes us a little effort to do that. Okay, so what I'm trying to get to, of course, is that there is only one form of indeterminism, and it's the one that is based on quantum physics. But there are an incredible number. Well, at least I've identified a dozen of them for you today, which we now need to take a look at. There is only one irreducible freedom, I say, based on a genuine randomness that provides for a world with breaks in the causal chain of all the determinisms. And that quantum mechanics is the fundamental source for this indeterminacy and unpredictability in the physical, the biological, and the human worlds. It is this indeterminacy that generates what we call an agenda for our micro-mind in the cogito model for free will, which, although I believe I've been pressing it forward more strongly than any other thinker at the moment, I want to remind you that I've researched and found another 25 or so scientists and philosophers who've considered something very similar to my two-stage model. None of them really convinced anyone, sadly, although some referred to earlier work, some claimed that they were proposing such a model, but often it wasn't as clearly seen as I believe I will show it to you. So let's roll up here to the determinisms themselves. Give a few minutes to each one of these. And I've just put them up here in alphabetical order, so you probably have heard of some of them, but not others. I hope you'll kind of familiarize yourself with them, so when you're in a discussion with others who claim there's some determinism, you can ask them, so what determinism do you have in mind? You know, is it a religious, is it a psychological, is it a mechanical, is it, and so forth. Let's just list them here. First, I've described behavioral determinism, and this assumes that all our actions are reflex reactions which have been developed by a process called environmental conditioning, so that behavioral psychologists have shown that this is possible, especially for lower animals. They can be conditioned to behave in a way, and then you can predict more or less exactly what they're going to do, at least rather well. Now, I point out this is the so-called nurture side of the famous nature-nurture debate. Okay? Both nature and nurture are arguments, you should see, for determinism. And the view of behavioral determinism was developed mostly by the American behaviorist B.F. Skinner, although John Watson, the English scientist who originated the idea of behaviorism, certainly was extremely strong about the idea that there's no mind in our brains, in our heads, and that we are all the product of a process by which, when we do things, we can be rewarded for doing the things that the behavioral psychologist wants to condition into a human or into an animal and so forth. And we also get punished when we do the wrong thing. And there's a good deal of thinking when I was first a graduate student at Harvard that Skinner, who was developing formulas for when we should reinforce, when we should punish, and there was a schedule of these things that were worked on pigeons, famously. Skinner's experiments mostly used birds, and hoped to show that he could get these birds to know behave in a certain way, most extremely. He had a vision that he could train the pigeons to look at a map of the world below a bomber in World War II and train the pigeon to recognize the industrial plants that needed to be bombed. Needless to say, this didn't work out at all well, and the bombing as itself soon deteriorated into not just hitting industrial targets, but vast numbers of civilians in the bombings like Hamburg and Dresden, where basically the cities were not bombed, they were just burned down, killing many, many people, not only in Germany but in Japan, where I note that well over 100 cities the size of Cambridge here, we have 100,000 people, were destroyed, and the order of half of their populations were killed in these dropping napalm, not just bombs, because bombs blow up a specific thing, and they made sense when you're trying to destroy a ball bearing factory or something, or a munitions plant. But when you want to destroy a city, bombs are too selective, and so we learned to drop napalm, which basically sets everything afire, and when a city is made up of wooden or relatively primitive housing, the whole city burns to the ground, and many people are killed not by an explosion but by the heat and the elimination of oxygen. They die suffocating and so forth. A topic that bothers me a good deal, as you might see, and maybe someday we'll get in beyond philosophy into political issues. Okay, number 2, biological determinism. This is the nature side of the nature-nurture debate. We all know that there are certain behaviors that we have that seem oddly like things that our parents or siblings might have done. And it's always a trick to distinguish, since we grow up in the same household with our siblings, whether that is something we were environmentally conditioned to behave, or whether it was somehow deep down in our genetic makeup, because there's no doubt that much of behavior of each organism comes to it genetically, inherited from the parents. Of course, causal determinism just simply says every event has an antecedent cause in the infinite causal chain going back to Aristotle's prime mover. There is nothing that's uncaused, there's nothing that's self-caused, and one modern philosopher who holds this view with his what's called basic argument that everything must have a cause is Galen Strawson, the son of the great P.F. Strawson, whose Freedom and Resentment essay moved the discussion over, or changed the subject more or less, from the notion of free will or freedom to moral responsibility. Strawson famously showed that we would always feel a moral responsibility. We would react to a crime or react to a very nice event in a way that would be determined by our sense of morality, which wouldn't go away even if we were shown that the indeterminism of quantum mechanics was just an illusion, and that someone came along and showed quantum mechanics wasn't relevant. Now, another of the dozen or so that I want to mention, you probably have heard of fatalism. And why is fatalism not exactly the same as causal determinism? Because it's the simple idea that everything that's going to happen is fated to happen, so that humans have no control over their future. And notice that fate has an arbitrary power and need not follow any causal or deterministic law. It can include the miracles of an omnipotent God, for example, and one can just say, well, it was fate, and it could do anything it wanted. Whatever was fated happens. Que sera, sera, so forth. Historical determinism is the dialectical idealism of Hegel, or the dialectical materialism of Karl Marx, that are assumed to govern the course of history. And this is a kind of very theoretical notion from politics, that what happens is following an absolute spirit or a guiding force, not thought to be causal and mechanical simply. And logical determinism is in a similar notion, because it reasons that a statement about a future event happening, okay, this is Aristotle's sea battle famously, is either true or not true. And if it is true that there will be a sea battle next Monday, then logical certainty necessitates that event. If the statement is not true, the argument is the event cannot possibly happen. For logic, the truth is said to be outside of time, like the foreknowledge of God, that this sort of truth is somehow outside of time. The idea that we're determined by our language and linguistic determinism was a very popular idea. And there is a certain feeling that the things we learn to think about, the things that we learn to know and then express to one another, was described by great linguists Sapir and Whorf, Benjamin Whorf, the hypothesis that our speech patterns and the way we form a language community become predictable because it's in there in the statements, the things that we can say. That was taken seriously for quite some time. Now, of course, mechanical determinism explains that man is a machine. If Newton's laws of classical mechanics govern the workings of the stars, the planets around our sun, then it seems to many that surely humans, man, must be governed the same way. You'll find this in the literature many places. We come to look out at the universe and we see everything behaving in perfect, repetitive ways, you know, years coming and going, planets spinning, all very predictable. And people said, surely those laws that govern the cosmos must govern us. Now, quite strangely, I think that's correct. I think that the laws, in effect, physical laws, maybe biological, how things are happening, in particular how information structures are managing change when they're living things, do tell us that the way in which the universe was formed can give us insights into how we are acting, or able to act, but I will try to prove that that involves a considerable amount of freedom and creativity. And another term is called necessitarianism. The word determinism, which we're now dealing with here, is actually a relatively new invention. It was coined sometime in the middle 19th century. And before that time, we had people who were called necessitarians. And they believed that nothing is contingent, is the opposition term to necessity, and that necessitarians want to say that it is logical and causal determinism would be simply, in their terminology, necessary. One of the earliest quotes out there is that nothing happens by chance, it all happens by necessity. That goes back to one of the original atomists, Leucippus. Physical determinism, then, is to say the laws of physics apply to every atom. And so every atom in the human mind must be perfectly predictable once enough neuroscientific measurements can be made. So we can go on to a higher level view, looking at the mind from the point of view of psychologists. Psychological determinism is the idea that our actions must be determined by the best possible reason or our greatest desire. Otherwise, our acts would be irrational. And this is a complicated one because it seems clear to me there are plenty of times when human beings are irrational. Even animals not only make mistakes, but they don't necessarily always act in their own best interests. We all of us have something of that problem. Now, religious determinism is the consequence of the presumed omniscience of God. God is said to have foreknowledge of all events. All times are said to be equally present to the eye of God. Thomas Aquinas called this a totum simul. Let's go to the close-up view here. This Latin phrase, totum simul, is that everything is simultaneously and it can be seen at one moment. So notice the multiple logical inconsistencies I point out in the idea of an omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent God. And this is something I find surprising that we don't see it more mentioned as a puzzle in theological circles, okay? Because it's a very simple logical idea, and much of what we're talking about here in understanding ourselves and whether we're determined is to think logically about everything. So consider this case. If a God exists who has all knowledge of the future, this God is omniscient, it knows the entire past, the entire future, and sees them all at one instance before the eyes of this God, then I think it seems logically obvious to say that such a God, such an omniscient God, is not omnipotent. Because what does that mean? If God is omnipotent, surely she or he has the power to change the future, just like we do. But goes the logical argument, what? Suppose knowing exactly what's to happen tomorrow, the omnipotent side of our God steps in and changes what's happening tomorrow. Surely that now tells us that this God was not omniscient, did not in fact know what that God was going to do the next day. Anyway, I find that one to be a very interesting one. And the idea that God is also benevolent, all good, all-knowing, all-powerful, and good, the problem of being good leads to the problem of evil, something we will discuss in our other book on great problems. Now, spatiotemporal determinism is a 20th century new invention, which came out of the work of Albert Einstein and his principle of relativity. It was called a block universe by Hermann Minkowski and some other philosophers, and it assumes that time is simply a fourth dimension that already exists, just like the three spatial dimensions. The one possible future is already out there, up ahead of where we are now, just like the city blocks are out to our left and our right and so forth. And J.J.C. Smart, who I had the privilege of speaking to a couple of times by telephone and to Australia, and I should say, did hold this view. He's no longer with us, and he called himself somewhat of a fatalist. And that is my feeling of what it is to believe that relativity, that the physics of relativity is giving us a picture which just the picture itself says that the dimension of time, the future, must be out there already. There's only one possible future as a result. So, coming back to compatibilism, I would like to say that it is a form of determinism. Compatibilists believe that as long as our mind is one of the causes in the causal chain, that we can be responsible for actions, which is actually very reasonable of them. But most of them think that every cause, including our decisions, are predetermined. So compatibilists are determinists. And that's my listing. I'd like to just add a few things. Something we touched on a couple of days ago in looking at Dan Dennett on my Wednesday Philosopher page. I found that Dan and many other compatibilists actually are saying that it's moral responsibility that is compatible with these determinisms. Let's see if I can home in on Dan particularly. He's saying that moral responsibility, what he calls being a moral agent, having moral competence, is something that is compatible with determinism. And I accept that. Moral responsibility is a convention. It's something each society has its own ideas about what's wrong, what's right. These are all perhaps programmed into everyone, and some person who has a computational view of mind like Dan. But in any case, the compatibility of moral responsibility with deterministic laws seems quite reasonable. There are clearly many agents in the world and some animals that we say don't have free will or don't have the measure of freedom we expect of humans, but they need to be held responsible. And the way we do it is to just punish them, and because that will have a consequential change in how they behave. I think that's what gives rise to the idea. But then even libertarian philosopher like Bob Kane, that we've also discussed in past weeks, seems to identify free will with moral responsibility. He describes it as the traditional definition of free will, that free will is moral responsibility, that if you are morally responsible, it shows you're free. This goes back to some ideas in Kant, I believe, and certainly in the scholastic philosophers, medieval philosophers, and many others. They have argued that to do something wrong is to indicate that you're not free, that to be free is to act morally. And this is very strange, because it's quite clear to me that our freedom also gives us the freedom to be evil, sadly, I must say. If we are free agents, and there are many free agents who are out there doing bad things, I can't absolve them of what they've done by saying, well, they didn't know what they were doing, or they were not free. I can see cases where they may have been addicted to something or constrained in some way. Someone has a gun to their head, that's said to be they are not free. If they then do something evil because they're under pressure from others. But that's a complicated discussion, and I try to leave moral responsibility to the side of the issue of whether we have the fundamental freedom to do whatever we want to do within our physical capability. So that's our summary of our free will. Only one way to be free, and that's to involve random generation of ideas which begin new causal chains, fresh starts, Aristotle called them. New beginnings where the beginning happens in our head. It's up to us, he said. It's up to us because we are the origin of certain ideas, and those ideas come about freely. Einstein called them free creations of the human mind. And that's the only indeterminism, the only basis for freedom which comes from not having one of these dozen freedoms or determinisms that I've laid out for you today. So tomorrow we're going to be philosophers and scientists today, and I'm going to be discussing the work of a colleague of mine at Harvard named David Lazer. Have I succeeded in getting this going? I think so. In his book, Cosmogenesis, David Lazer worked on a problem that I was working on as well, thinking about. Let me back up a little bit so I've got a better view of this. This is his 1990 or so book on the growth of order in the universe. Let me just home in on that as tightly as I can get and say this is what we'll be discussing tomorrow. And let me go zoom in with my powerful tool here. Not quite as easy to use as it might be. Thank you for forgiving me for making a lot of mistakes with my new technology. I've designed this ITV Studio to be a tool that lets me deliver webcasts from a lab where I also participated with the very first podcast 14 years ago. And I'm very happy to have built it, and it's giving me the power to come to you this way, wherever you are in the world. Today, there are 3.5 billion smartphones, and I'm hoping to put together short, brief, interesting messages about what we do know about the way the world is, the way we are, the way we came about, the way the universe came about, and make them available to people who have just a little smartphone that they carry around with them as the future best way to learn new things. So thank you very much. I hope you'll enjoy my improvements in the website I mentioned at the start of the show, and I hope you'll find the little clickable links to go to your Facebook page or tweet a message out like our tweeter-in-chief, but in this case with things that I hope are really good news and help us understand the world. Thank you very much.